was a woman obsessed with a light. In her crude laboratory in a rough old shed that was steaming in summer and freezing in winter, Marie Curie had become entranced by a luminous glow that radiated from certain minerals on her working table. She was so tormented by this elusive radiance that she could barely think of anything else. For long hours she labored, night and day, missing sleep, sometimes scarcely eating, and often becoming weak and ill under the strain, all to uncover the secret of its source and strength. When she did discover it, she found an element with an unprecedented power to both destroy and heal. Curie called it radium. Those who knew her as a child could have predicted that someday Marie Curie would make a great contribution to humanity, for even when she was young, she demonstrated not only brilliance, but a humble desire to serve and help others. She was born Maria Sklodowska, November 7, 1867, in Warsaw, Poland, the youngest of 5 children. It was a terrible time for the Polish people. Their country was under the control of the Russian Tsar, who made every attempt to eradicate Polish culture and history. All school classes in Poland were taught in Russian, from Russian texts. The Polish accent was ridiculed, and Poles were expected to be subservient to their conquerors. Maria was a feisty and patriotic little girl who grew up with an abhorrence of tyranny and rebelled every chance she got. Maria had 1 brother and 4 sisters, all of them beautiful. The girls had delicate features, blonde hair, steel-gray eyes, and luminous complexions. Marie Curie was a beautiful woman all her life, even though in later years she developed a somewhat stern expression that distracted from her delicacy. Brains and talent were natural in the Sklodowska family. Marie's father was a scholar who taught physics and math in a Warsaw high school. Her mother was a musician who had once been principal of a girls' academy. Now, with 5 children, she'd had to give up her career. As a child, Maria wondered why her mother never kissed her, but patted her hair affectionately instead. It was because Mrs. Sklodowska had tuberculosis and was afraid her children would contract it, but she kept her disease secret for many years so as not to worry them. Maria's father, who was rebellious like his daughter, got into trouble with Russian authorities at the high school he worked in, who decided he wasn't subservient enough. His salary was cut severely, and the family had to take in boarders to make ends meet. At one time, there were as many as 10 people living in the already crowded house, with Mrs. Sklodowska attending to them all. The family was so poor that Maria's mother even made her children's shoes. One day, when her older sister Branya was having trouble reading, 4-year-old Maria picked up the book and began to read out loud. Her parents looked so astonished that Maria began to cry, thinking she had done something wrong. When she started school, her teachers were just as astonished by her intelligence as her parents had been. She was so fluent at Russian that when inspectors dropped by the class, it was always Maria who was asked to rise from her chair and read from the Russian text. Then, as soon as the inspectors were out the door, the teacher would secretly bring out the Polish textbooks and teach their students about their own language and country. Maria was 2 years younger than her classmates, but she was the top student in languages, math, history, and literature. At home, she liked to sit and stare into the glass case that held all the wonders of her father's work. Inside were tubes, scales, and minerals. When she asked him to explain them, she was satisfied with his 2-word response: physics apparatus. But in her mind, the simple description seemed to promise marvelous adventures and discoveries. Maria was a happy child in spite of her poverty, until she reached the age of 9 and had her first experience with loss. Her 16-year-old sister Zosia caught typhus from one of the boarders and died. Branya caught it too, but after a long convalescence, she recovered. Maria was still mourning Zosia when 2 years later, her mother finally died of tuberculosis. For the 11-year-old Maria, it was a crisis of faith. Although she always remained a Catholic from the time she lost her sister and mother, Maria Curie was filled with doubt about God's benevolence. Years later, her own daughter Eve wrote of that time. She no longer invoked with the same love that God who had unjustly inflicted such terrible blows, who had slain what was gay or fanciful or sweet around her. Her tragedies made her less devout, but no less spirited. As an adolescent, Maria was still an exceptional student, earning awards and medals for her studies in Russian. But on her way to school each day, she always took the time to spit on the monuments erected by the Russians to the Poles who had betrayed their homeland. When she graduated high school, Maria's father decided she should have a year off for all the hard work she'd accomplished. It was a delightful time in her life, in which she healed from the loss of her mother and sister, and developed a love for the country and nature that never left her. She hunted for wild strawberries, went swimming, fished, climbed in the mountains, and went to balls. She wrote to a friend, "I have no schedule. I get up sometimes at 10 o'clock, sometimes at 4 or 5 in the morning. I read no serious books, only harmless and absurd little novels. Thus, in spite of the diploma conferring on me the dignity and maturity of a person who has finished her studies, I feel incredibly stupid. Sometimes I laugh all by myself, and I contemplate my state of total stupidity with genuine satisfaction." But stupidity was neither her nature nor her destiny. Back from vacation, Maria joined up with a group of young political activists in Warsaw who met in secret to talk about underground movements of the day, read pamphlets, and discuss possibilities of reform. They believed the best way to improve society was to build the intellect and educate the poor who had deliberately been kept ignorant. Personally, she felt science was the most promising path to freedom. Maria was only 17 years old at the time, and the group was probably very naive itself. But years later, she still championed their ideals. She said, "The means of action were poor, and the results obtained could not be considerable, yet I persist in believing that the ideas that guided us then are the only ones which can lead to true social progress. We cannot hope to build a better world without improving the individual. Towards this end, each of us must work toward his own highest development, accepting at the same time his share of responsibility in the general life of humanity." While meeting in secret with the young reformers, Maria was also attending a secret university where bright Polish students were taught science, sociology, and other subjects, and asked to pass their knowledge on to others. At home, Mr. Sladowski was finding it more difficult to take care of the boarders, and his income had shrunk to almost nothing. It soon became necessary for the children to make their own way in life. Maria's brother Joseph had already enrolled at the University of Warsaw, where he was studying medicine. Maria's sister Branya, equally as good a student as Joseph, had been forced to enroll in medical school in Paris. The Tsar's universities refused to accept women. Maria, now 18, came up with a plan to help her father and sister. She took a job as a governess so she could support herself and help pay for Branya's schooling. She sent part of her salary every month to Branya, who tearfully protested that the sacrifice was too great. Maria ignored her protests. Someday, she said, she too would move to Paris and go to the university. But for now, it was Branya's turn. Maria could barely endure her post as governess. She had nothing but contempt for her wealthy employers, whom she considered crass and pretentious. She said, "It is one of those rich houses where they speak French when there is company, a chimney sweeper's French, where they don't pay their bills for 6 months, and where they fling money out of the window, even though they economize niggardly on oil for lamps. They have 5 servants. They pose as liberals, and in reality are sunk in the darkest stupidity." She soon left this unenviable position and took another with a much more pleasant family of an agriculturalist who lived in the country. Life there would have been almost perfect if not for one complication. Maria fell in love with their oldest son. The parents had respect and affection for Maria, but the idea of their son marrying a penniless governess was out of the question. They sent him off to college, leaving Maria behind to suffer the tortures of hurt pride and unfulfilled love. Although she wanted to quit, Maria knew that both her father and Branya depended on her income. Eventually she found another position, but she remained a governess for 5 years. She was 24 years old before she could persuade herself to leave her father and younger sister Hella and join Branya in Paris, and she did so only after she first found Hella a job. When she boarded a 4th-class railway carriage for the trip to France, she was embarking on the most important journey of her life. Once in Paris, Maria settled in with Branya and her new husband, a Polish revolutionary and fellow science student. One of the first things she did was change her name from Maria to Marie. The next thing she did was to register under that name for science courses at the Sorbonne. Maria was joyful to be in Paris. Here it was a free republic where people could speak their own language, think what they wanted to think, and find all the books and classes they needed to improve their minds. She was happy living with Branya and her husband, but soon she had to move. Branya was expecting a baby, and Marie had found that the 1-hour trip from Branya's house to the Sorbonne